If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. Welcome back to the podcast. I am sitting here once again in the forest with Ed the Protestant.
Here I am. I got, was it 2 episodes or so ago that, you beat me up a little bit because I was supposed to be introducing myself and I didn't say I didn't say the right thing.
Well, you were introducing yourself. You weren't following cues.
Oh, okay.
So you were like, this should feel to the listener like a professionally done thing. And it was like, I'm trying to sort of set it up and then cue you to come in and introduce yourself. And then you were like either jumping the cue,
right? And
I didn't get to finish setting it up, or I, set you up and then you just fumbled it. So we're striving, even though we're sitting here on a picnic table
right
in the woods with, gas station pizza down the road.
Right.
I mean, we're at least striving for something that at least feels like a professional kind of...
A modicum of professionalism.
A modicum of professionalism in this podcast. And I guess I was disappointed because you, having been a professional musician all your life, don't you guys all do a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and follow each other? And I just kind of felt like if there's one thing I should be able to rely on from you as a musician, it would be like knowing, those beats and those cues.
Now, of course, that messing with your pace is that the prospect of doing that is now rearing its ugly head.
Oh my gosh, you're crushing my mojo here. Okay, so let's welcome back to the podcast. I am here with Ed the Protestant. Go.
Hey, really good to be here. How was that? That's my radio voice.
Yeah. All right. Okay, so anyway, we're sitting in the woods, we're sitting at the picnic table, we're talking again, and we're going to talk about, Catholicism and considering it and all that stuff. And we're in this series that we're kind of doing, on and off series a little bit, about the reasons that people either don't go to church, or they leave the church, or they want to have nothing to do with the church, and how we reach them through evangelization and how we understand that. Right? And we're kind of doing a different episode on different reasons that people have. And one of the reasons that seems that people either leave the church or don't come to it in the first place is that it doesn't feel like it matters. Their experience of the church or their perception of it is that it isn't important, or it isn't, what they see isn't about like life and death things. It isn't existential. And that a lot of their experience of the church is very banal, or just kind of prosaic, ho-hum. And if they're going to be involved in something, it seems like the church should be about the biggest and most important things in life.
That's what I've always thought, is that if I can't get big answers here, then why am I going, right? I want to know the truth about the universe. And I understand that it's complicated. It's not, it's not easy. No quick answers, but I don't want to feel like where I'm going to church to tie into that. I don't want to feel like they're sidestepping it or shortchanging it. I want it to be about big things.
I have said over the years to people back when I was preaching or whatever, people would come and say, hey, I'm looking for solutions to my problems. But it always seems to me that there's like different categories of problems in life, right? Like, I can't find 2 socks that match this morning, so I have 2 that are close to one another, but not exactly matching. So if one were to examine my socks carefully, one would notice that they don't quite match. Now, I guess it's a problem. It doesn't feel like a big problem, unless you're standing up on stage. I tell you about the time that back when I was a senior pastor and we were doing multiple services, and I go to church one Sunday morning, and the whole Sunday morning, people are complimenting me on my shoes. They're like, oh, love the shoes. Hey, Greg, Pastor Greg, love the shoes. And I'm like, huh? thanks. Because like in my entire life up to that point, I had nobody had ever complimented my shoes in my entire life. And then it was like I got 10 or 20 compliments on my shoes in one morning. And I was like, wow, but I've had these shoes for a while. So then after the last Sunday morning service, my wife and kids were at the last Sunday morning service. And afterwards she goes, you're wearing 2 different shoes. Because in the closet, I have 2 shoes that were like kind of the same design. And one pair was black and one was brown. But in the closet in the early morning light when I was getting dressed,
they looked the same.
They kind of looked the same. And so I had one black one and one brown one. And I didn't realize 3 morning worship services later. And that's why they were complimenting me. They were doing it ironically.
Okay, so I was just going to ask. So everybody was taking a dig at you. Everybody who said,
it was all passive aggressive. They were all like, oh, nice shoes.
The only thing you can say in that instance is, the weird thing is I have another pair at home just like
Exactly. So anyway, so I would say that is a problem. It's not a high order problem. And it seems to me that if you come to the church looking for solutions to your wardrobe problems, or maybe even your relationship problems, or your money problems, or this problem or that problem, maybe even some of your health problems, those you could make a list on the wall, on the whiteboard. You could list the significance of these problems from the biggest to the least. But what I always used to say to people is, if you come to Christ, Christ doesn't promise to solve all those problems. Not everybody's cancer is going to go into remission. Not everybody's going to get a new job. Not everybody's financial issues or everybody's marriage is going to get fixed. And not everyone's going to find 2 matching shoes in the closet in the morning.
Right.
But what Christ promises is to solve your ultimate problem.
Yes.
Not all your particular temporal problems. I mean, he promises to solve those ultimately, because when he comes back, we read in Revelation 21, then when he returns, there'll be no more mourning or death or crying or pain or the old order things. But at least in this life, he's not going to solve all of your temporal problems, but he does promise to solve your ultimate problem. And your ultimate problem is that you're going to die and you're facing an eternity separated from God. And what he promises is, God gave his only begotten son so that those who believed in him would have eternal life. And so that hope of the resurrection, that hope of last things, we've talked about it on the podcast. Corey and I have talked about the last things, sin and death and heaven and hell.
Yeah.
Those are the big stakes. Those are the big things that matter. Sin and death and judgment and heaven and hell, eternal destinies. And when we come to the church and the church promises nothing more than making our life a little more comfortable in the meantime, but doesn't deal with those ultimate existential issues, it becomes prosaic and
If people are convinced that the end result is contentment and happiness and comfort, if that's the end result, you can pretty easily find a way to make an end run around God and just get that done yourself. You can just live selfishly and,
I'm sure you've had this experience. Your kids or people around you say, why should I go to church? And it's interesting to hear the answers. What we often do is we try to answer that question by appeal to those temporal small problems. So we'll say, it's good to go to church because, that way you get to meet people and be around a supportive community. Okay. It's, I love going because it makes me feel really good and the music is great and there's some great people there and you'll love Father someone's. And those things may be true, but again, they don't have to do with those ultimate eschatological issues of, death and judgment and heaven and hell and our ultimate destinies. And it seems that Christianity is and should be about ultimate destinies. At every given moment, you're either on a trajectory to eternal joy or eternal misery. And every action you take is either moving you towards one of those destinations or the other. Right?
Well, yeah.
And the church has to be about those things. And when we reduce church, those of us who, are in church leadership or programming or ministry, and we make the faith, we make Catholicism, we make Christianity, we make the church about these short-term temporal things,
Right.
We're sort of small balling it.
Yep.
Week in and week out, there are pastors or preachers who are every Sunday reversing Jesus's miracle and turning the wine of the gospel into water.
That's a good way to put it.
So we were talking before. I've been talking too much. You go with this about some of the experiences we've had in life with people for whom they just they're bored with church.
I've been bored with church, but I've never been bored with trying to find the right answer. I'm amazed that there are people who just don't ever think about what the answer might be. This is what has led me to Catholicism, is wanting answers. And over a lifetime of being a Protestant, literally, I've been a Protestant longer than lots of people even live. I just kept not finding the answer. And pretty soon, I'm singing worship songs that are about me, and I'm hearing sermons about, I'm not hearing a sermon about the things I shouldn't do and how I should behave and sin. And pretty soon, I don't blame people who go to church and don't ever get a good dose of the real thing, the real gospel, to hear the position they're in with God and what the answer is to being in that position. If you don't hear that and you go years not hearing that, and pretty soon I don't blame people for drifting away, because all the things the church offers you could get someplace else.
It's interesting you put it that way. I can't remember who it was, this was many years ago that I heard this guy speak or read this, but somebody compared that to vaccination or vaccinating people against the gospel or vaccinating them against Christ. So right, the way a vaccine works is it introduces a very small amount of the virus, like just enough to prompt your body to build up resistance, antibodies, but not enough to overwhelm them, right? That's the whole theory between a vaccine. So you give somebody whatever it is, the polio vaccine or a little bit of inert, weak, diluted polio strain.
Right.
And then their body goes, oh, I see that. And then builds up their resistance, right? So when the real thing comes along, what we're doing is vaccinating people against the gospel or Christ, because they come to church and they get a small, weak, diluted bit of the gospel or Christ.
Right.
And it's just enough for them to build up antibodies. So they go, yeah, I've heard all this before.
Right.
Yeah, blah, 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 yada, yada, yada. Right. Accept Jesus. Don't, go to hell, this, that, good news. Heard it 10,000, heard 1,000 times. But they don't ever hear enough of it at a potent enough strength to really make any difference. And then it becomes very difficult to reach those people, because when you try to talk to them about the faith, they're like, yada, 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 I've heard all this before. Is that making sense? Yeah.
You were saying, I'm going to steal your quote here from Flannery O'Connor, whom I've read just a little bit of. I need to go back and read a bunch more about the Eucharist. And she said, basically, to paraphrase here, if the Eucharist is just a symbol, then I'll just pass. Thanks. I'll go do something else.
Yeah, her quote was even a little more
salty
than that, because she said, if it's just a symbol, then to hell with it. I don't need to go and have pageantry and symbols. If it's just a symbol and doesn't mean anything, and isn't about anything other than some symbol, I can find better things to do. I think this is where, especially in the Catholic Church, for a long time, especially in the post-Vatican II Church, this is, how I say this, the potency of the Eucharist in people's lives was reduced, not because the Eucharist stopped being potent, but because their perception of it was. And so when you look at how people stopped believing in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and one of the reasons why they stop, and you're not going to just talk them back into that, give them proof text and all that, it's that we didn't treat it like it was the real presence of Christ. I don't want to touch the third rail on that, because there's a lot of controversy about it, but we started giving communion in the hand, and we started being very lax in the way that it was distributed, and lax in the way it was celebrated. And then it was surrounded in the Mass in some parishes or some churches by a whole lot of like frivolous stuff, frivolous music, frivolous this, frivolous that. And then what ends up, you go, oh, yeah, this thing is super important, but we don't treat it like it's super important.
Yeah.
Right?
I've been to baptismal services where they were just like a big party, or something. And if you go a long time being told by the people who you go to get serious answers from, if you're told by them that it doesn't really matter, it's not that important.
But the thing is, though, they wouldn't say that, but they act like it.
Yeah.
And that's my point, is that we don't act like any of this is really true. You think, okay, I'm going to go to church on Sunday, and here's the thing about Christianity. Either it is the most consequential thing in all the universe,
right,
or it's not. It's not kind of consequential. So if you actually believe that the creator of the universe, creator of all things, poured the fullness of his being into a man who lived in what is modern day Israel, right? And died on a Roman cross and rose again and is coming back to remake heaven and the earth. Either that's true, in which case there's nothing more important than that.
Right.
I mean, what would be more important than that? When we say the Apostles' Creed, like when you pray your rosary, right? I believe that he's coming back to judge the living and the dead. I believe in heaven and hell. I believe in my eternal destiny. I believe in eternal life. I mean, either this is true, in which case, oh my God, we ought to like really take it super seriously, and it ought to be the most important truth in our life. And that would be incumbent then on those of us who are sharing that truth, whether personally or professionally, in the sense of people who are running, ministries and programs. Either we treat this like this is the single most consequential thing in the universe and the single most consequential thing in your life, in all of our lives, or it isn't. It can't be kind of, you know what I'm saying? You can't be kind of God, and it's kind of about heaven and hell, and it's kind of about the remaking of the universe.
And with the ever spreading theology in I'm making a hand motion here because this is audio.
But it's done very professionally. I was going to assure everyone that Ed is at the moment, he's got his headphones on and he's leaning into the microphone and he's making it what appears to be a very professional sort of
hand
podcasting gesture.
Podcasting gesture. That's right. Where was I? Okay, so if Protestantism is constantly splintering off, the general direction seems to me to be farther and farther away from the gospel and your need of salvation and sin and hell and damnation and the consequences of acting. If it's pretty soon, it's so diluted that there isn't, I'm utterly uncompelled by it. And I see even in the most, I've talked about this a little bit. There's a church that my wife and I have gone to, a big church where we haven't been there in a while, but where we both participated in the music on stage, really good music program. I knew everybody and all that, But even I'm watching even them, and I know some of the people involved in the leadership, and they're very serious, but they're not presenting what I think is a serious, they're not, I'd like to be a little scared when they tell me, maybe you better sit up straight and think about this because this is important. The message is always, you're fine. You're fine.
I mean, it's back to that phrase that gets translated in English about God-fearing. And then you always, the people go, I don't want to believe in a God that I have to be afraid of. But I mean, there is a thing of God-fearing being that I understand that this is consequential. This is existential. Right? I respect that God in my life and the issues involved with that are of ultimate consequence.
Yeah.
And I am deeply, gravely, if you don't like the word fear, I am gravely concerned about my relationship with God. And I think the temptation for a lot of churches or for a lot of Christians, even a lot of Catholics, is for us to downplay that. Because, I think, first of all, it's hard to sort of run on high octane preaching all the time. Like when we would look at, fire and brimstone preaching, you can't just get up there 52 weeks a year and go, you're going to go to hell
Right.
today unless you, I mean, that's what the churches that do that.
Right.
There's another altar call today, right?
Right.
So it isn't so much about standing up there in every Sunday and every mass and going, you're facing a Christless eternity unless you make a decision for Jesus today, because
Right.
otherwise you send that. But everything that we talk about should ultimately be tied to these kinds of existential questions.
Right.
Because at every moment, C.S. Lewis had some line, I can't remember where it was in one of his books, where he said, "You have never met an ordinary person."
Oh, I remember that.
Because every person that you've ever met is an image of God, an immortal image of God with a soul that is facing eternity.
Yeah.
Either an eternity with God or an alien from Him. Every person that you've ever met is in some process of becoming, a saint.
I think what he said was people are in the process of becoming something that if you saw it in its completed form, you'd be tempted to fall down and worship it.
Yeah,
And
or the other in horror.
You would shrink back in horror.
What you saw, a soul that had, been damned for eternity.
Yep.
And so he said, there's no ordinary interactions. There's no ordinary people. The stakes, this matters. The stakes are absolute. Now, again, that doesn't mean that every Sunday the pastor in the homily has to stand up there and go, today come down on the altar call and accept Jesus. But everything that we talk about in the faith matters.
Right.
It matters. So I think one of the reasons we avoid it is that nobody wants to feel like they're on that high octane thing all the time. But I think there's this other thing where it becomes easier. So do you remember back in the seeker movement? I'm sure you do, when we would always sit in these creative planning meetings to plan the services?
Yeah, I do.
Oh, yeah. And you'd sit around the room with the creative team. That's always gets me, and I want to look back on it. It's who was planning the liturgy and planning the worship? A creative team. Not saints or holy people or liturgists, but a creative team. And we'd all sit around and we would talk about, remember this, the difference between perceived problems?
Felt problems?
Felt needs.
Felt needs, there it is.
That was the phrase. Your felt needs versus your real needs. And we'd say, okay, people, their real need is God and eternity, but, they're wrapped up in their felt needs. Like, I can't find 2 socks in the drawer that match.
Right.
I've got, my bills, or I don't like my job, or my wife and I are having marital troubles, or my kid is a little brat, or I've got a health issue. I mean, those are your felt needs. Those are things you perceive to be problems. And so the thing with the creative team was, what we'll do is we'll make the services and the preaching and everything about people's felt needs, because that'll draw them in, because we'll be talking about all that stuff. And then in talking about all that stuff, then somewhere in there we'll get a chance to sort of transition the conversation to the big picture questions.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that transition didn't always happen because partly it was a bait and switch.
Yeah.
We're going to make this all about that. But then if you get in here, we're going to bait you with that and then switch to big existential questions. And a lot of times that never really happened, or people didn't follow you with the switch. And the church became about addressing everybody's felt needs. And I think that's a temptation for staff or leaders, because it's so easy to sort of engage the people, right?
Yeah, I don't want theology that I dreamed up. I don't want a God that I made. I like God to be big and mysterious and powerful, and that's what I want.
I remember a pastor friend of mine said that way back in the Willow Creek days or whatever, he had gone to some church growth conference, and he said that the speaker stood up there and said, to grow your church, remember all that? Grow your church and reach the unchurched people and, whatever. What you have to do is do sermon series that are about their felt needs, right? What are the things that they're, worried about? And he said, surveys indicate that the number one thing people are worried about is money. And so, you should plan an 8-part sermon series about money because people are worried about money. And my friend says he raised his hand in this breakout session and said, I think I would do it in a 1-week series. And the guy said, what do you mean? And he goes, and he pulled open the verse where Jesus says, don't worry about money. He goes, I mean, if I'm going to preach the gospel, Jesus says, don't worry about money. Don't worry about these short-term temporal things, right? He says, look at the lilies of the field and the birds of the air. He said, but be concerned about those things that are of ultimate stakes, Jesus says. This is in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, be concerned about those ultimate things. Those are the things that matter. And I think because churches have, for a variety of reasons, diluted or reduced the content of the preaching or the ministry or whatever and evangelization to all of those temporal felt needs, what has ended up happening is that a lot of people have become, as we said earlier, sort of vaccinating against it. They just don't.
Yeah.
They just don't think that going to church really matters because it doesn't. It's not, especially people who are Christians and have been and have become sort of bored and burnt out by it.
Yeah.
And they don't feel like it really makes a big difference in their life whether they go or not.
I can't tell you how many times I have heard in the last 5 or 10 years somebody say, what I think it's really all about is this. And every time somebody does that, they let themselves off the hook. That's the point of saying what I think it really is all about. Like I said, there was a young woman that I was sitting at a picnic table with a young woman, a bunch of other folks, and she said, I just really think that all you have to really do is love Jesus. And the other grown-ups were just nodding along, and I thought, it wasn't my place. But I wanted to pull her aside and say, no, you're all wrong about that, and here's why. But I hear that kind of thing from people because I think Protestantism, forgive me for bashing, encourages it. You're encouraged to come up with your version of how God loves you and what he wants from you. And even not directly, but indirectly, man, I hear it. I hear those kinds of things from people.
So I understand the point you're making, and I think it's valid, but I might say it phrase it a little bit different way.
Yeah.
Because the lady who said that, she is kind of right. It is about loving Jesus, right? I mean, what else is it? It's about loving Christ. I mean, God gave his only life for us. He gave his only begotten son for us who died, lived, so that we would respond and love him back and follow him. In a sense, she's right, but this goes to that issue of vaccinating people because you've taken that loving Jesus, which should be an ultimate thing. I mean, it's about taking up your cross and following him, right? It's about the people who were in the crowds that followed Jesus in the Gospels and loved it when he was, giving out sandwiches, and loved it when he was healing people, and loved it when he was saying nice things.
Right.
But when he called them to follow him and follow him despite the consequences and give things up for him, it was like, yeah, not so much. And the effectiveness of any lie or mistruth is to mix just enough truth into it. So this whole thing, it's not just about loving Jesus. It is. I mean, ultimately that's true, right?
Yep.
But loving Jesus means something. That's, I guess, maybe a good place to end this because it is about ultimate things. What it means to love Christ and the consequences of that and the definition of that, to love him the way he loved us. He loved us with that sacrificial love. He gave his life for us, and that we would take up our cross and follow him. That's what it means. But if what it means is sentimentality, that we have good feelings about Jesus, right? So the effectiveness of that statement is that it's just true enough to make people go, yeah, ho-hum.
Which was the context of that conversation. Should you go to church? Should you do this? Should you do that? What do you have to be worried? Oh, I think it's just about loving Jesus. In other words, just about having feelings.
If I can have good feelings about Jesus at the beach or on the boat or on the golf court, but Jesus calls us to a decision. He calls us to a conversion. He calls us to a life. He calls us to a road of sanctification that means something, that matters, that's consequential, that's existential in its dimension.
Which is why I'm drawn to the Catholic Church.
Yeah, because I think that the Catholic Church does a pretty good job of making it about those things. But we, as those who are trying to help others, need to keep it focused on those things and not allow it to kind of devolve into kind of this prosaic ho-hum thing of no great consequence. And I think that has done more damage to allow people to slip away from the church or not come back to it than anything else.
I agree.
Okay.
That's good talk.
All right. As always, why don't you do this? Because this is a professional kind of podcast. Why don't you close it out? Like do the professional podcast closeout.
All right. As always, we're glad you're listening. We would invite you to the Considering Catholicism website, where you can find all of the episodes, and they're categorized, and you can do a word search, right, for those things. We'd love to get.
Hold on. A professional thing would then give the URL.
Oh, it's consideringcatholicism.com. There we go. I'm just a baby. Forgive me.
Amateurs.
And I'm such an amateur. And then love to get emails and questions at Greg at
just considering Catholicism
at gmail.com.
Or they can send them to you.
Or they can send them to me at theprotestant@yahoo.com. I don't have all of Greg's answers, but I certainly would love to hear from people. And finally, this is produced all on a wing and a prayer, and any money that you could, any coinage you could drop our way, it doesn't have to be a lot. Every little bit helps. Would be appreciated. I don't get any money for doing this. This is completely gratis on my part. I feel like I'm coming out on the better end. But Greg does all this, in his, I don't want to say in his spare time, but Greg's the one who produces this. And it's, it always greases the skids to have a little money to put into production and, So
this can become a more professional
so that
operation.
I could be more, exactly.
All right.
Do.
Thanks. Pretty good. We'll work on it.
All right.
Hey, thanks everybody. We'll be back in the next episode to talk about more whatever stuff.